Hello, everybody. I am Marc LiVecche. I am the McDonald Scholar for Ethics, War, and Public Life at Providence Magazine, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And I am happy to be here today with my friend and U.S. Air Force officer, Joe Chapa, who's a sometimes contributor to Providence. And we are going to talk about Joe's new book, which I'll introduce in a moment. But Joe, first, just thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's always a pleasure to talk with you. And it's true, I'm an active duty U.S. Air Force officer, but everything I say here is just my own views. It doesn't necessarily reflect the Air Force or the Department of Defense.
That's right. Very good. And I just incidentally, I like how you often caveat that by saying, isn't it awesome to live in a country that allows a guy like me to speak my mind? Just give it a little bit of a caveat. So I was going to say that's a hoorah moment, but I guess that wouldn't be an hoorah moment exactly because
Not for us in the Air Force.
not for you. So anyway, the book, which is outstanding, is this, is remote warfare moral, with an important subtitle, Weighing Issues of Life and Death from 7,000 Miles Away. And Joe, you've been on the circuit, you've been doing all sorts of fun interviews that for some really bizarre reason, I haven't been asked to do for my book when it came out. I should write different books, I think. And Joe also, and this could be ordered now, this book, but the audio version can be pre-ordered, right?
That's right.
And you just did the recording yourself.
That's right. Yeah, I've narrated the audiobook for the audio version. I'm really excited about that.
Yeah, me too. I'm going to have Joe Chapa in my ears sometime soon, and that's exciting. I want to read, in order to launch the interview, I want to read a section for those who are following along. It's on page 133 under the chapter Good Guys and Bad Guys. And I think this does several things. One, I think it sort of sets up maybe the basic premise of why you wrote this book, but it gives an important if-but clause, which I think also sets up a number of potential tensions and issues within it. So here's the section. I'm going to tee up a question for you to respond to. The section is this. The question that lies at the heart of the morality of remote warfare is whether a person can have a moral justification for killing a combatant from thousands of miles away if we approach war as a contest that is largely defined by mutual reciprocal risk for both sets of combatants. Then the case for the justified use of remote weapons looks dubious. But approaching war in this way overcomplicates the question. What's going on there, and how does that work, if it works, as a reasonable summary of the background to the book itself and some of the issues that you're trying to deal with?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. That's a great line to pull out to kind of set the stage. So for years leading up to this book, for about the last 10 years, maybe a little more than that, I have been very interested in this debate. I used to fly the MQ-1 Predator as an Air Force officer. And so every time a new paper or a new book came out on the ethics of quote unquote drones, I read with great interest. And I have lots of books in my house with lots of underlines. My wife told me actually that we had neighbors once when I was living in Colorado Springs, and she met these neighbors and they said, what does your husband do for a living? Does he edit books or something? Like, no, he's just a nerd that sits on the front porch and reads these books and marks up all the things that he disagrees with. So in that literature, I found much to be desired. And one of the themes that I struggled with was there was this frequent, I wouldn't say universal, but a frequent claim that traces back to Clausewitz, the 17th century or 18th century war theorist, who says on the first page of his book on war, says, to go straight to the heart of the matter, war is like a duel. And then he goes on from there. And so several theorists sort of picked up that line and said, yes, war is supposed to be like a duel. But when we picture this airplane over the battlefield, whose pilot and sensor operator are 7,000 miles removed, and then we have this seemingly sort of helpless victim on the other end under the crosshairs, right? That relationship doesn't look anything like a duel. And so there must be something about this that doesn't count as real war. Maybe it's not real war. Maybe they're not real warriors. Maybe they can't avail themselves of the permissions under just war thinking. And so a lot of the arguments that were really pretty anti-remote warfare were grounded in this kind of conception of war as a contest between two combatants. And so the if-but clause that you point to there is absolutely, if we start from the premise that battlefield engagements must be relevantly like a duel, then we will ultimately conclude that remote warfare in the sort of realm of predator and reaper also can't count as war. And I just think it's a doubtful claim to begin with.
Yeah, right. I mean, it almost makes it right that the misperceptions or confusions that people have about remote warfare are actually, at least in part, simply confusions about warfare, right?
I think that's right. Yeah, I think that's right. And I should defend Clausewitz here for a second. The very next part of that line, right? He says war is like a duel, and then he goes on to say countless duels go to make up a war. And then he said we can picture war like this: picture two wrestlers, each one is trying to compel the other to do his will, right? And so it seems like we're bouncing back and forth between a couple different analogies here. And Clausewitz has several definitions of war that appeal to several different analogies throughout the book. But what I want to focus on is that I don't think Clausewitz has in mind here two opposing combatants on the field of battle. I think he has in mind two opposing political communities. And those political communities are acting like a wrestler that's trying to throw the other wrestler. Once we get down to the individual level, the level of individual combatants, Clausewitz doesn't seem to indicate that those engagements need to be like duels at all. And in fact, in a different treatise, an earlier letter that was posthumously published, he extolled the virtues of surprise and subterfuge. And of course, those would be anathema to the duelist, right? If you are going to a duel in the traditional sense and you hid in the trees or you hid in the tall grass and tried to snipe your opponent, you would not be participating in a duel. And yet in war, Clausewitz is all for the ruse, the subterfuge, the deception. And so I just think people are misreading Clausewitz there and applying his words at the tactical level when he meant them to apply at the strategic level.
No, that's right. No, that I think that's convincing, and you lay that case out really well in the book. Going back down to this tactical level, or the level of the warrior, vis-a-vis the other warrior, what are some of the hazards that are there? You have a phrase elsewhere in your book where you say, so I'm gonna misquote it a little bit, but war is not for the warrior. The warrior is for war. Why is that a morally significant thing to say? And where does that tie into this question of the place of remote warfare and warfare more generally?
That's right. So let me kind of zoom out a little bit and just recognize that lots of people, maybe lots of our viewers here today, kind of feel a little bit icky about remote warfare. And I want to take that seriously, right? So people have natural intuitions that cause them to say, maybe I can't put my finger on it, but there's something morally suspect about conducting warfare from 7,000 miles away, probably most directly because of the risk asymmetry that distance imposes, right? So if the person under the crosshairs in Afghanistan, say, is facing all of the risk, and the crew in the cockpit in Nevada is facing none of the risk, that makes me feel uncomfortable. So I want to acknowledge that and recognize that I'm sympathetic to that concern. I just don't think that the arguments out there had adequately explained what those concerns were about. So that's one of the reasons for writing the book, is to try to work through some of that and straighten some of that out. So let me just give you a sense for some of the tension. So this week we learned about it, but last week the United States reportedly killed Ayman al-Zawahiri in Afghanistan. He had been the number 2 leader in the al-Qaeda organization for about the last 10 years, and before that, he was the leader of his own jihadist organization. So he certainly has blood on his hands. I think most commentators I've read have said that this was morally justified, because as I paraphrased lots of warfighters in the book, he was a bad guy, right? Or he was a bad dude. So we can talk about the details of that another time, but assume that was morally justified. I noticed, actually, because I went on the Mehdi Hasan show on NBC Peacock to talk about my book. He was very kind to have me on, and I thought he treated me very fairly, but it was clear that he has strong views about some of it. So he tweeted just a few days ago, and I'll just read part of the tweet. He says, "I'm a long-standing critic of US drone strikes. Having said that, Ayman al-Zawahiri is an anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, anti-Shia mass murderer. If he's been killed, I won't be shedding any tears for him." So it seems like there's a tension here, right? I don't like drone strikes, what I would call remote warfare. It makes me feel uncomfortable, but it seems like this was morally justified. And so again, that is essentially the tension that sets off the whole debate over the last 10 or 15 years, is that some have been saying, this, from the warfighter perspective, this feels a lot like traditional warfare. There are people on that side of the conflict, there are people on this side of the conflict, And our job in the military is to use technology to achieve military objectives in the most ethical way possible. This looks a lot like that, right? The weapons are discriminate. The fact that the warheads are so small helps us with proportionality. Obviously, none of that's perfect, right? But we're moving in that direction. Technology is helping us with that. And so again, we're stuck with this tension of it feels kind of morally suspect, but we don't quite know why. So it's a very long-winded way of getting to the answer to your question, which is one of the arguments people have made is that war is meant to be a crucible for something like self-discovery or self-actualization. And if you read war memoirs from across centuries, that is one of the things that sometimes accompanies war, right? Young people, traditionally often young men, go off to war, have a formative experience. Maybe the friendships that they made in the foxhole were the best friendships of their life, or maybe the work that they did as a soldier was the most important work they will have ever done. And so there's these formative things. And I think some people have this idea that that's so critically important. The Reaper pilot probably doesn't have that, right? Because they're not in the foxhole, they're not being shot at, et cetera. And if we lose that, then have we lost something of what makes war what it is? And the reason I want to push back against that idea is because I think if we allow ourselves to think in that way, it starts to feel like we have created war so that we can provide young people with this self-referential crucible of self-discovery. And you and I know as just war theorists, that is not a legitimate justification for the horrors of war, right? We should not go to war just so that we can provide this opportunity for people to have this self-actualization. So I want to stiff arm all of that and say, no, actually, if war is about what we say it's about, which, as just war theorists, again, what we say it's about is defending the innocent, right? If a just war is about defending the innocent, then I don't want to create a space where it looks like we've invented war for some self-referential reason.
Yeah, right. No, there's okay. So there's a lot there. That's all fantastic. One of the things that I don't want to lose that you just said that I'm afraid is going to fall out of my head if I don't get this out first is if we have a certain perception of what war is, and if remote warfare doesn't seem to fit into what that perception is, then one of the other hazards of all of that, it would seem to me, is to tell guys like you who think you've done acts of warfare and who might be feeling emotional or moral confusion about what you've done in combat, pulling the trigger on someone, all of that. Now we're suggesting to you, actually, you've not been to war. You're not a warrior, which it seems to me would have all sorts of second order consequences when it comes to things like dealing with PTS or even the prospect of moral injury. Do you think there's a danger in that direction that we unintentionally present to war fighters like yourself?
I do think there's a danger. I hadn't planned on mentioning this, but there was an event, I think it was an event that you put together, and I met a veteran of the British Army, and he had served in Northern Ireland during the Troubles. And he said that there was such a noticeable difference in how his own family members and friends treated his service relative to other veterans who had served in other places, right? And so there was something that it's his word, not mine, but he said it was almost shameful, right? They weren't proud of his service. They didn't want to talk about it. They didn't want to hear about it. And we have a mutual friend from the RPA community who has called this the sin eater problem, right? That, we're going to ask you to do dark things. Taking human life is a dark thing always, right? Even when it's morally justified. We're going to ask you to do those things. And then we want you to just own that. We want you to kind of sit with it. That's your problem. We, as your fellow citizens, aren't going to take any responsibility for that, right? And I think that does set up a real challenge where a person could feel as though they've done dark things. I won't say unjustified things, but they've done dark things. And there's not the same kind of absolution that one gets when one returns from war, reintegrates with society, and society kind of puts an arm around the veteran and says, thank you for your service, in short, right? Thank you for doing that thing that you did on our behalf. And so I don't think it's as bad as all of that most of the time, but I do think there's a little bit of a tension there that's worth ironing out. Now, I will say I wouldn't want to go so far in that direction, right, where we essentially raise the same problem that I talked about a minute ago, where now it's like we're just going to say that everything's justified, everything is permissible, because we don't want people to feel badly about what they've done. Well, I certainly don't want that either, right? So we need to strike a balance somewhere between those two extremes.
No, that's right. So, and this, this insight that you're touching on, this idea that, and I want to get to this more directly in a moment, but this idea that there's got to be something about reciprocal risk, and the business of war fighting is, man versus man, and this whole sort of conflict, and then we sense that at least some dimension of that is absent in remote warfare. And that and now I've just completely lost where I was going to go with this. But there seems to be, when you bring up the question of honor or shame, here's where I was going with this, is we made it even more complicated, because on the one hand, as you've said already, killing is always dark business. But the traditional war fighter, who's on the ground and who kills, we think, okay, maybe that was dark business, but there's a certain honor in what they've done because they've taken on all these risks themselves. Whereas the remote warfare pilot, like the tweet you quoted from, almost resonates like we used to treat assassins or spies, right? That this is a particularly dark or dirty thing to do, to stab someone in the back, or to turn on your own country. And so you're a bastard for doing this, but you're our bastard, and we really need you. And so there seems to be an even deeper and more awkward tension, because we, not only the very business of war fighting, but the manner in which we fought this war, we recognize that it's necessary and it's salutary for our own goals. And so we'll have you do it, but we really don't want to talk about it. There seems to be that kind of a tension too.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one of the challenges I had with some of the literature in the past is that it was very clearly, and through no fault of the author's own, right? It was clearly written from an external perspective, from the perspective of someone who hasn't seen this kind of warfare from inside the cockpit, because it looks and feels very different. And I've met people where we bring people who used to fly, let's say, fighter airplanes or bomber airplanes into the ground-based cockpit during an operational mission, right? And I have had those people step out of the cockpit and say, that was unbelievable. I felt my hands get sweaty. I felt my heart rate increase, right? I felt like I was there. And that is how it feels, right? So again, I think part of it is, if we kind of pretend like the only thing involved here is an airplane, a crew 7,000 miles away, and a target, we miss the fact that in the way the US military goes to war, these airplanes and crews are integrated into the joint force. And so all of that apparatus, whether it's the person sleeping on the ground in the Marine Corps, the person in the $40 million fighter airplane, or the person 7,000 miles away, all those people are engaged in a joint effort, right? They are doing this together. And it's for the reasons that our elected and appointed civilian officials have sent us to do them. Right. And so I think for most people who have flown the Predator and Reaper in the US Air Force, it just doesn't feel that removed. It doesn't feel like we're operating on the fringes or on the outside. It feels like we're very much integrated into that joint force. And so again, I think those perspectives matter a huge deal. And if you only have the external perspective, then it's really hard to kind of wrap your head around all of that. And again, not to overly plug the book, but one of the efforts in the book was to interview enough folks, enough pilots and sensor operators, that I could bring some of those stories in to try to give people with an external perspective a little bit more of an idea of what it's like to do the job from the inside.
No, I think that's right. And just to go ahead and plug the book strenuously, I think that's one of the strengths of it. You write like a dream. You integrate what I think is really top flight philosophical thinking with narrative, and the stories you tell over and over again. Some of them are horrific. Some of them are you can almost say heartwarming, right? So you go into great detail illustrating both how whatever the distance happens to be, because of the technology behind or within the remote systems, guys like you are actually more intimately involved in or more intimately aware of what killing might mean and what it might look like than maybe a lot of other supposedly more traditional war fighters, right? And you tell some of the graphic stories that go with that. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then at the other side of the spectrum, guys like you are able to to share almost intimate moments with US warfighters on the ground, as maybe you provide overwatch while they sleep. And I think it's in one of the chapters in your book. Maybe we just talked about this personally, but I think it's in the book where you say that, you know, one of the RPA pilots had the opportunity to protect a crew who was on the ground. And I think as he nodded off to sleep, he said, "This is the first sleep we've had in days." But they were able to take that rest because they knew, you know, there was a reaper, or maybe it was a predator overhead keeping them safe. And so you tell the human story behind what seems to be, you know, a weapon system that is completely absent of humanity. And I think that's one of the strengths, is you make it very human.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I appreciate that. And you know, that is one of the interesting things about this debate, is that it usually assumes that the thing that changed in 2001, so October 6th in the evening, 6th, 7th, 2001, October 6th, 7th, 2001, following the September 11th attacks. This is the US's opening night of the war in Afghanistan. That was the first time that a Predator released a Hellfire missile in combat. And so people point to that moment and say, and that's what changed everything. Right. And one of the questions I ask in the book is, okay, but what is it actually that changed? And you might think, well, the thing that changed is that now for the first time, we have the capability of causing harm through military force from really, really far away. And actually, no, we had that capability for a long time. In fact, what we gain on October 6th, 2001 is the ability to do it with much more situational awareness, right? Because the previous tools we had were ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, which, you know, once you launch them, you're not getting them back. And the explosive yield is enormous. And then cruise missiles, which again, back then, once you launch them, you're not getting them back. And the lag time might be several hours, you know, 5 to 6 hours of flight time or something like that. And so now instead what we get is a human crew that can perceive, not perfectly, but they can perceive to some degree what's happening on the ground. And then they can react to those observations. And I think you're right, that's true both when they're trying to target, you know, adversaries, but also when they're trying to support friendly forces. One of the stories I tell in the book, I just happened to interview, I didn't know this at the time, but I happened to interview a pilot and a sensor operator separately, and they ended up telling me the same story, the story of the same sortie, right? So it turns out they were on that mission together. And essentially the Joint Terminal Attack Controller on the ground was confused under the fog of war, and he passed them target coordinate grids for his own folks, for a group of his unit that had been separated. And it took this crew to step in to say, this does not feel right, something's wrong here. So they kind of just put the brakes on the whole thing, right? But they're only in a position to do that because they've been on station, they've been observing, they can gain some situational awareness, and then be a real participant in the application of combat power. And, you know, nothing against the you know, fighter and bomber crews that we work with, but oftentimes, especially on the fighter side, they just don't have the time, they just don't have the gas to sit around for hours and right. become a part of this mission in the same way. And so they tend to come in and drop and leave. And that also is an important capability, but it's just different.
Right. So, I mean, maybe just, you know, we don't need to get into the technicals too much, but, you know, whenever I dig into the technicals, I'm continually fascinated by the weapon system. So is this correct that it fully loaded, a Reaper might be able to loiter for about 14 hours? Or if you reconfigure it so you have some external gas tanks, they could be aloft for like up to like almost 2 days, is what I've read somewhere. Is that an exaggeration, or?
That second one sounds like an exaggeration. I don't feel qualified to give you exact numbers, but something close to 24 hours is good as a planning factor. So that's noticeably more than a typical average sortie duration, right? So if you're going to go fly, let's say a 22-hour sortie, that's probably at least 3 different crews, right? So you're now, it's fascinating to me just as I read the history of air power, but traditionally you have one airplane and one crew, and when the airplane goes home, the crew goes home, and there's no deviating from that pattern, right? And here you actually have to sort of aggregate this sortie across at least 3 different sets of crews, and that's just a different way of conducting aviation or, you know, combat air power. It's just different. But I think the persistence has done more to affect the capability of this weapon system than the distance has, because the distance is really about efficiencies, and the duration is where you get the ability to do persistent intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance.
Yeah, that's right. So let's go into a little bit of a defensive. I mean, we've been doing it, but a little bit of a defense of the system, right? Any operation is going to have to be concerned about three things, if I understand correctly. You're going to want mission effectiveness. You're going to want force protection, protecting our own people, and you're going to want to respect non-combatant immunity, right? I mean, if that's your thing, then as you go through, the remote systems, it just seems self-evident, like check, 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 right? Can you walk us through, and even in light of the Zawahiri hit, how does the RPA enhance our ability to be mission effective, to protect our own, and to protect the innocent? We've touched on this in, I think, numerous ways, but can you pull all that together?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't want to leave anyone with the impression that these airplanes are a panacea for all
Right.
for all of our challenges. They're,
Well
they're
said.
certainly not, right? And as I've already said, they work best when they are integrated with the joint force.
Right.
So just having one airplane and a handful of crews that can persist over a target really doesn't give you that much information.
Yep.
In fact, there's a quote in the book from General McChrystal, who had been the commander of coalition forces in Afghanistan as a 4-star general. And he says, when you see the world in 2 dimensions like that, it gives you the perception that you actually know what's going on the ground, but all you know is what you see in 2 dimensions. And that's an important distinction. But I will say that the ability to persist over the target and to see that 2-dimensional picture when combined with other inputs, right, other sources of intelligence, is really powerful. And so I think that's one of the, as I said, the duration really, I think, is the thing that changed around 2001 that provided this new capability. But I would be reluctant to say, well, let's just abandon all of our other efforts, right? The RPAs can do it all. I certainly wouldn't want to go down that route.
Right. So you've seen Maverick, I assume,
Yeah.
new Top Gun, right? In the very beginning, you've got Ed Harris, and man, I hate to disagree with Ed Harris, but at some point, Ed Harris, cautions Maverick, more or less, you're a dinosaur, right? Your kind is on the way out. And he seems to be gesturing to this new mode of warfare, right? So, when I was a kid, turns out I don't have the eyesight for it, probably don't have the stomach for it either. But, I saw the first Top Gun in a theater, and I had aspirations of flying jets someday, preferably off ships. Kids nowadays are going to be sitting in Maverick. Some of them are going to develop an aspiration to fly jets, maybe jets off ships, but jets in general. Are they going to grow up, and are they going to be able to have the opportunity to fly jets in service to their country? Or by the time an 8-year-old or a 9-year-old is ready to do that, are human pilots a thing of the past?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm reluctant to predict the future of technology.
Sure.
I feel like I would have gotten it wrong for the last several decades, but we're moving in a direction where it's just my prognostication here. I think we're moving in a direction in which we will require fewer pilots. So think about, and I mean, pilot writ large. So there are missions that pilots do right now that I think we could automate somewhat easily, right? Not with the technology we have now, but maybe the technology we'll have by the time that 9-year-old is, ready to commission. Now, whether we're going to have the sort of institutional will and the trust and all of that is a different question, but I think we'll have the technology to do it sooner. I do think there are going to be places where we want to ensure that human judgment plays an important role in warfighting. And so that doesn't mean I need a pilot on board every single airplane, right? You might have a fleet of, a dozen autonomous loyal wingmen is one of the terms the US Air Force uses. So maybe I have those loyal wingmen, but I still want that traditionally piloted F-35 to orchestrate that swarm, right? To direct that swarm. And so it might mean that it gets more and more competitive for 9-year-olds who want to become fighter pilots when they grow up, because we might have fewer seats to put them in. But I don't see that role going away in the near future.
That's probably heartening for some of our listeners, I think. I guess in closing, one of the things you caution critics or the skeptical about RPAs to remember is that at the end of the day, the RPA is really just another weapon system, and it could be a force for good, it could be a force for evil. What is the caution that you bake into that? What does it mean to say that the RPA is just another weapon system, and it's really going to depend on how we use that weapon system?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's almost a truism, right? I think that should be obvious to most people. I think the critics would say yes, that's true, and the United States has not used them well over the last 20 years, right? So I think that's the critical position. From my perspective, I think we, the United States, have worked really hard to treat these weapon systems as airplanes in the traditional sense, right? So that's really more about pilot training and maintenance, but it does have implications on things like command responsibility. So I have several accounts in the book of times when the ground force commander said release a weapon, or the ground force commander's joint terminal attack controller said release a weapon, and the pilot said no, it doesn't look right to me, I'm not doing it. And I think that's crucial. I don't want to give that up to the point where they become sort of, automata that just have to do what they're told. So I'm glad that we've instituted those practices, but I also, everything that I've seen from the inside suggests to me that we, the United States, go to great lengths to ensure that we're operating within the bounds of morality and law in our armed conflicts. And I know there are critics who disagree with me about that, but everything that I have seen suggests that that's the case. So have we set precedents that we think are appropriate for the rest of the world as these weapon systems start to proliferate to states that don't have advanced militaries or even non-state actors? Have we set the right precedents? Certainly not to 100%, right? Certainly there are things I wish we had done differently. But I can look back and be relatively proud of the sort of the system that we put in place. We, the United States, put in place to manage the way that we conduct these operations. I don't mind telling you, though, that I think the strongest argument against remote warfare is the moral hazard argument that says, if you make the resort to force easier and easier, eventually, heads of state or elected officials or Secretary of Defense, whoever it is, eventually they'll be incentivized to resort to force even when it's not the last resort. And that's not something that I want to have happen. But I also think the cat's out of the bag on the technology, and we can't go back. And so what I would like to see is us, the citizens of the United States, impose discipline on our foreign policy so that there are political costs to resorting to force when we ought not to resort to force. And some people will say that's, I'm just dreaming, and that's not something that's feasible. But I would much rather hold our policymakers responsible for their policies than pretend like it's the drone crews, quote unquote, the drone crew's fault when they execute the policy that they're given.
Oh, that's right. And again, just to touch on what I think is the value of the anecdotes you tell in the book. It's never going to be the case, it seems to me, if you've got a human being in the system somewhere who knows what happens when they pull the trigger. It may be easier for the politicians to wage war, but it's never going to be easier for the guys who are pulling those triggers. And so when you tell these stories and the intimate knowledge that flight crews in the remote systems have of what it is that they are actually doing, those costs are always going to be borne by those who we send to do the fighting itself. So that, again, I think that just illustrates why the stories you tell are so essential. Last question. You rightly caution us to continue to impose discipline on how it is that we wage war. Are the old constraints still going to be helpful for these new technologies? The just war tradition, the rules we've already imposed for millennium on how we wage war, do those still matter?
I think they do. I don't think we need to rewrite just war theory to account for modern technology, but I do think, as you suggest, right, as long as the human is engaged and aware of the harm that they're causing, they will always be kind of a bulwark against the worst horrors of war. One of the concerns I have, though, in the future is that we might not have weapons in which the crew sees the destruction through a $1.2 million camera, right, which is what I did. You might have crews that are, maybe in the F-35 pilot's case, staying outside of the enemy's threat ring, sending the autonomous loyal wingman forward and not actually seeing the destruction that they cause. And I think that puts pressure on us. I'll include both of us, right? Because you've taught midshipmen and I've taught cadets. And I think the burden is on people in our profession to raise up future military leaders that are willing to put the time in to recognize the harm that they're causing, even if they're not watching it in real time. And I don't think that's trivial. I don't think that's easy. But I think that's what we're going to have to do. Because if you look at things like autonomous weapons, which I've mentioned, or cyber warfare, where you might cause harm in the physical world through cyber means, right? Or hypersonic weapons, which would be launched, from continent to continent. those are places where we're going to increasingly see remote warfare be a mainstay of the way modern militaries fight. And I think imposing that bulwark is crucial. But that's a training challenge. And I don't know how to get there, but I think that's where we need to focus.
That's well said. Very good. Joe, thank you so much. There's so much more we could talk about. So I hope we do this in a live venue sometime, have another kind of interaction. But until then, the book again is Remote Warfare Moral? And it's by Joe Chapa. Joe, thank you for the book. And thank you for the care that you continue to give our nation's warfighters and of course for the service that you yourself have done. So appreciate you.
Well, thanks so much for having me, Mark. Thanks for the kind words. And really, it's always a pleasure.
Excellent.